Hello and welcome back to the fifth and final instalment of the Superpower Relations topic, ranging from 1943 to 72 for the Edexcel IGCSE History course. And we're looking at the thaw and move towards détente from 1963 to 72. I'll be looking at two effects of everything listed in the specification so that you can nail question B, and it will certainly help you question C with question A as well. Let's begin with Hotline. There are quite a few things that you need to know for this section, but a lot of them have a similar effect of the relationship between the Soviets and America de-escalating, and so this will recur a lot throughout all of these things, so it's a lot easier to remember. So the first effect of Hotline was that there were decreased tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. So they established a hotline in 1963 between Washington, the White House, and Moscow, which meant that future conflicts could be avoided by direct communication. This came after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a lack of clear communication, so this could make sure there was clarity and both sides could discuss with each other very, very easily. This also led to less fear of nuclear war breaking out and a decrease in the production of nuclear warheads, because the world had been so close to nuclear war at Cuba. This represented part of the decline of the production of nuclear warheads, as both sides realised just how dangerous nuclear war would be. The second effect was that it showed a thaw in the Cold War. So having this hotline meant that there was increased cooperation between America and the Soviets, and this led to even more cooperation, for example in ending the nuclear arms race. So as we'll see in the next few slides, the signing of the Test Ban Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, all of this showed that they had a common goal of easing tensions, of reducing their use of nuclear weapons, and ending this competitiveness that the nuclear arms race sort of embodied. And it also showed an increased awareness of the environmental dangers of, for example, nuclear war. So radiation and the killing of animals, trees, people. There were a lot of things that would go wrong with nuclear war, and so they're backing away from the crevice. They're seeing how awful it would really be. Then onto the Test Ban Treaty. So again, the first effect is that it decreased tensions between the US and the USSR. So they signed this treaty in 1963 again, and both sides agreed not to test weapons underwater or in the atmosphere. That's nuclear weapons. The only way that they could now test them was underground, but this was very, very expensive, and so fewer weapons were tested, and therefore fewer weapons were produced. So the nuclear arms race began winding down. Again, shows they were aware of the dangers of nuclear war after Cuba and how close they were to nuclear war then, and that they wanted to decrease tensions. The second effect is that it showed an increased knowledge of the environmental dangers. So there had been a lot of scientific research here, and so both sides began to understand the dangers of radioactive fallout, the damage radiation does to the environment, to animals and to people, obviously, and with over 100 countries also later signing it, it showed the world itself moving away from nuclear weapons and realising how destructive and awful they are. And it just shows a thaw in the Cold War. Countries abandoned their nuclear weapons programs, or at least rolled them down, put less funding into it, and there was more cooperation on reaching an end to these increased tensions which we'd seen over the past decade and so. The Outer Space Treaty then, again, decreased tensions between the US and the USSR as the first effect. So this treaty was signed in 1967, and both sides agreed not to place nuclear weapons in space, i.e. so that it could go above, for example, the Soviet Union, and you could easily fire nuclear weapons directly on top of it. So this stopped the nuclear arms race going any further, for example, them both competing to see who could first put nuclear weapons into space, and so it decreased the competition between America and the Soviet Union. This led again to less nuclear weapons being produced, nuclear arms programs being wound down, and so nuclear war looked less likely. The second effect is that it led to a thaw in the Cold War. So states, when they signed this, they accepted responsibility for any damage caused by their own objects in space. So this just showed an increased awareness of environmental damage, and making sure that we take care of the Earth, and showed again just awareness of the danger of nuclear weapons. Could you imagine the havoc that would cause if radiation got into the atmosphere? And 112 countries later signed it. Nuclear war just looked a lot less likely, as countries were now abstaining from trying to advance nuclear warfare into space, and so it just showed the world coming back from such a reliance on nuclear weapons. The next thing to look at then is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So, just like before, the first effect is that it decreased tensions between America and the Soviet Union. So this treaty was signed in 1968, and all sides agreed to work together towards disarmament. So they would work together to reduce nuclear weapons worldwide, so to stop storing and reducing as many of them. And this meant that the likelihood of nuclear war decreased. There was less production of weapons, less funding put into making more of them, and fewer were kept just in case. So therefore the world was just moving away from nuclear weapons completely. There was a decrease in tensions, a thaw in the Cold War, and the arms race had really stopped. Not only were they banning certain parts, but they were saying, well, we are going to completely put an end to nuclear weapons, hopefully, in the future. The second effect was that nuclear weapons would not be shared. So many countries also signed this, including Great Britain, including China. They agreed not to share nuclear weapons with other states, and this meant that they couldn't, for example, fall into the hands of terrorists, or countries where there were leaders who could potentially misuse them. So this showed that they had learnt lessons from Cuba, where obviously the Soviets had shared nuclear weapons with Castro, because they didn't want tensions to increase, with countries fearing nuclear weapons being right next to them, and showed that they were aware of the responsibility that they had in having nuclear weapons and the damages it could do if they were misused, again, to the environment from fallout, financial pressures as well. Nuclear weapons programs really did cause a huge drain on how much on different countries. So this showed a move away from them worldwide. So now looking at reasons for détente, basically just an easing of tensions between the two sides. So firstly, Nixon became President of America, and he promised to end the Vietnam War, which had caused a lot of havoc, and many American soldiers have been killed, 60,000 soldiers in total. People had become fed up of this constant military action. America being at war in the Second World War, in Korea, there'd been a lot of involvement in Cuba, for example, that really escalated tensions, and now they're in Vietnam. People were fed up of all these wars, and so he vowed to put an end to it if he became president. $170 billion was spent on the war in Vietnam, so there was a real need to decrease defence spending, and to focus on things at home, like reducing inequality, like spending that money on things that people needed in America. Nixon also wanted to be friendlier with China, as they weren't getting on well with the Soviets, so there was still enmity between America and the Soviet Union, and so what Nixon wanted to do was to take advantage of this, and as the axiom goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He wanted to try to get friendly with China, so that the USSR would have two enemies. The Soviets spent, looking at the Soviets now, the Soviets spent 30% of their GDP on defence spending, and obviously they too would prefer to spend it on better living standards. There was still a long way to go before they would be completely recovered from the Cold War, and also from the Second World War. Really, there was still a lot of damage, so they wanted to spend their money on their home soil as well. Mao, leader of China, he disliked the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He had openly criticised it, and so he became friendlier with America. And Nixon visited China, for example, in February 1972. They got on quite well together, and Mao wasn't getting on well with the Soviets because of their harsh action, which was represented in Czechoslovakia, which we saw in the last video. And finally, there was a need for better relations across Europe between the capitalists and the communists. It wasn't working having such a huge divide across Europe, and so people generally wanted just an easing of tensions. I've put there Ostpolitik. You can look up that a bit more. It's not needed for the course, but that just shows this this idea that there were a lot of tensions across the world, and people just wanted a cooling down of them. There had been so much money and time and effort spent on the Cold War, and also on violence just in general since the Second World War, that people wanted to tone that down, and countries needed to focus on their own issues, and so there was a general move towards this easing of tensions, towards this thaw in the Cold War, towards détente. The final main thing you need to look at is the SALT treaties. The first effect of this was, guess what? It reduced tensions between America and the Soviets. So these treaties, one of them was signed in May of 1972, and it showed that there was increased cooperation between the two sides, and it listed many things. So, for example, both sides limited themselves to 100 missiles. So nuclear war looked less likely. They were storing less nuclear weapons now, with an aim to store even less in the future. It showed an immense awareness of the dangers posed by nuclear weapons to the environment, to people. They were making efforts to move away from nuclear weapons and to avoid nuclear war. They'd learnt their lessons from Cuba. They were very, very wary of nuclear weapons now. The second effect was that it limited the nuclear weapons programs of both countries. So the number of submarine-launched missiles was limited to 740, for example, so the arms race was slowing down. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were limited, relevant to the number of bombers each side possessed. So this, although it sounds a bit wordy, but it was crucial because it showed that both sides were making concessions. So America had more bombers, and so they said that they'd have less intercontinental ballistic missiles because they had it was easier for them to get short-range missiles across the world easily, whereas the Soviets could store more intercontinental ballistic missiles because it was harder for them to move across the world because they had less bomber planes. So therefore, the Soviets actually had more ICBMs, and this showed that America saying, all right, you can have that, and we'll take less. So they were working cooperatively, they were working together. Nixon and Brezhnev, leader of the Soviet Union, became a lot closer. They even visited each other's countries, and this led just to further talks and further cooperation, including SALT II in 1979. So the final thing you need to know is about the extent of détente in 1972, which is when superpower relations as a topic finishes. This is not going to be a B question, but it could well be a C question, just exploring to what extent it was good. So here's some positives and negatives. Both sides did still have enough nuclear weapons to begin a war, and nuclear programs hadn't stopped completely. They were still ongoing. There were still developments of nuclear weapons, still production of nuclear weapons. So they were still storing them, and there was enough to destroy the world still. So you could argue that if tensions had increased significantly from then on, nuclear war would still have gone ahead, and what has happened previously wouldn't have made much of a difference. But there was such an increase in diplomacy, for example, the Hotline, There was a better awareness of nuclear dangers. There were more treaties to limit the use and testing of certain weapons. So if this came up, you could reference the Test Ban Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there was an increase in friendly relationships between these countries. For example, them visiting each other's countries, these leaders getting friendlier together. And there's an image of Mao and Nixon shaking hands. And that is the end of this series of All You Need Notes for the Superpower Relations topic for Edexcel IGCSE History. And we've now finished the thaw and moved towards détente from 1963 to 72. I hope that this has really helped you. Yes, it is quite long and there's a lot of information you need to know, but hopefully that's helped. And if it has, also check out the series for Germany and the move towards dictatorship. And I'll also soon be posting videos on how to answer each question for paper 1. And if it has helped you, please do like and subscribe as well. It keeps me going and helps me produce more videos. So thank you very much. Goodbye.